where I enjoy being fair. I enjoy the pursuit of fairness as a virtue. I would like to see us apply the same rules to our friends as we do to our enemies. I don't think the end justifies the means. I think the manner in which we get places matters. And in politics, too often, winning is the only thing that matters.
I don't mind if people are wrong. I really mind if they're unfair. We can survive being wrong. We can survive calling jump balls differently. I'm not gonna make it if our system is perceived as being biased and unfair.
Losing is not the worst thing in the world. Not knowing what you believe and not caring enough about it to fight for it, that's the worst thing in the world.
Hi, thanks for tuning back in to episode 2 of Genuine Questions. My main objective with these videos is to show people that you can't trust the media to give you the full story on important national issues. But before we get to talking about some current events that are going on, I want to talk about some old stories that made me realize the tactics that the media and politicians use to deflect and distract us from what's going on. And once you see these, I think it's impossible to unsee them. So one tactic that we talked about in the last episode is that they just call anybody that questions their official story a conspiracy theorist. But we're going to talk about a couple more of those tactics here in this video. And the first one is that they take a fairly straightforward story and they make it so convoluted that people just get exhausted and stop caring about it. And a great example of that is the Hillary Clinton email scandal. So there were 2 email scandals that were going on in the summer of 2016. And we started talking about the DNC email hack in the last video and how it may or may not have been done by Russia. And we can read all of those emails on WikiLeaks. But that is an entirely different scandal than the Hillary Clinton email scandal, which have never been read because she deleted them. And with any investigation, I'm always curious to know the origins of how it came to law enforcement's attention, and then the investigative process by which that evidence was uncovered. And Hillary Clinton and the media will often cite people like Colin Powell and different Trump administration officials for doing the same thing, using private email, which is a lie. Those people like Colin Powell and others, they used a personal email account to conduct their government business, maybe something like a Gmail or a Yahoo account. But when they do that, those emails can then be forwarded to their .gov account. What Hillary did was set up a private server that her people were in control of, and then she refused to turn those emails over to the government once it was discovered that this is what she was doing. So we're going to go deeper into that story in the next episode. But for now, I want to explain how this private email server was discovered. And that was through the House investigation into Benghazi, led by Trey Gowdy. And another thing the media is particularly good at when it comes to these national political scandals is framing the issue in a way where each side has something to sink their teeth into to bash the other side, while they sweep the real juicy scandals that expose the corruption on both sides under the rug. A present day example of this would be something like Governor Cuomo being accused of killing like 15,000 elderly people in the nursing home. So instead, the media just distracts you with his sexual harassment scandal, which, what do you know, that's been swept under the rug now too, and we're not talking about any of it. But in the case of Benghazi, the right likes to focus on the fact that the Obama administration lied to the American people and the families of those victims that the attack was a result from a spontaneous protest to a YouTube video. And the left likes to say that this was a witch hunt into Hillary, and Benghazi has been investigated like 8 times and there's never been any misconduct found. But when I started watching the Benghazi hearings on C-SPAN, I realized that there was another very interesting aspect to this investigation that almost nobody talks about. There were actually 4 public hearings that in total it spans about 24 hours. So to save you guys the time, I've pulled the relevant clips of the part of this investigation that I found particularly interesting. So to start, I'll give the backstory here that after any attack on American diplomats, Congress commissioned something called an Accountability Review Board, also known as an ARB. And the ARB studies the attack and then makes recommendations to the State Department on how to prevent future tragedies from occurring. So this first clip explains why, in spite of all of those previous investigations that I just mentioned, people are still asking questions about Benghazi. So,
this committee is the first committee, the only committee, to uncover the fact that Secretary Clinton exclusively used personal email on her own personal server for official business and kept the public record, including emails about Benghazi and Libya, in her own custody and control for almost 2 years after she left office. You will hear a lot today about the Accountability Review Board. Secretary Clinton has mentioned it more than 70 times in her previous testimony before Congress. But when you hear about the ARB, you should also know the State Department leadership handpicked the members of the ARB. The ARB never interviewed Secretary Clinton. The ARB never reviewed her emails. And Secretary Clinton's top advisor was allowed to review and suggest changes to the ARB before the public ever saw it. There's no transcript of ARB interviews, so it's impossible to know whether all relevant questions were asked and answered. And because there's no transcript, it is also impossible to cite the ARB interviews with any particularity at all. That is not independent. That is not accountability. That is not a serious investigation. You will hear there were previous congressional investigations into Benghazi, and that is true. And it should make you wonder why those investigations failed to interview so many witnesses and access so many documents. If those previous congressional investigations were really serious and thorough, how did they miss Ambassador Stevens' emails? If those previous investigations were serious and thorough, how did they miss Secretary Clinton's emails? If those congressional investigations really were serious and thorough, why did they fail to interview dozens of key State Department witnesses, including agents on the ground who experienced the attacks firsthand? Just last month, 3 years after Benghazi, top aides finally returned documents to the State Department. A month ago, this committee received 1,500 new pages of Secretary Clinton's emails related to Libya and Benghazi, 3 years after the attacks. Now, a little over 2 weeks ago, this committee received nearly 1,400 pages of Ambassador Stevens' emails, 3 years after the attacks. It is impossible to conduct a serious fact-centric investigation without access to the documents from the former Secretary of State, the ambassador who knew more about Libya than anyone else, and testimony from witnesses who survived the attack.
So it's because of this House investigation that Congress uncovered that there were 0 Hillary Clinton emails sent on her .gov account, leading to this discovery that she exclusively used a private email server while she was Secretary of State, probably with the intent of shielding herself from these types of Freedom of Information Act requests. But as I said, we're going to explore that deeper in the next episode. So the first 2 hearings concerned the ARB. And one of the interesting revelations was that ARBs have been making virtually identical recommendations for the past several decades, meaning that the State Department has been ignoring the recommendations put forth to keep American diplomats safe. And the main recommendation from the ARB that has been routinely ignored is that the Secretary of State should personally weigh and balance the risk versus the reward of having a physical American presence in high-threat areas. So in other words, what foreign policy are we pursuing that is worth risking American lives. So here in this next clip, Gowdy is going to ask a representative from the State Department this very basic question. Why were we in Libya?
The second goal, Secretary Starr, was to underscore that these protests are rooted in an internet video and not a broader failure of policy. So I'm going to skip over the video part of that for now and get to the second clause, the dependent clause in that sentence, not a broader failure of policy. How can we judge whether or not a policy has failed or succeeded if no one tells us what the policy objectives were? Now, how can we do that? How can you weigh and balance the risk? Jimmy's gone through the risk. Members on the other side have gone through all the escalating episodes of violence in Benghazi. And it may well be that the reason for us to have been there supersedes all of those episodes of violence. But how? I mean, how can a committee of Congress know that if no one tells us why we were there?
So I'll save you all the trouble of watching the 24 hours worth of C-SPAN footage. Literally no one was able to answer that question. But there are a few questions that Hillary actually avoids answering that may give us an idea to why we were there. But first, speaking of avoiding questions, these congressional hearings can be particularly frustrating because a skilled politician can avoid questions during these very easily. So each representative has generally 5 minutes to ask the witness questions. And if the witness can eat up a lot of time while avoiding answering the question, they're essentially filibustering their own congressional hearing. And it leaves little time for the representatives to ask follow-up questions. So it's just about eating up time on the clock. And Hillary takes this to an art form. So I'm going to show you this next clip as an example here. So
my question is, this was a very important mission in 2011. You sent Chris Stevens there, but yet when our compound is attacked in 2012, what kind of culture was created in the State Department that your folks couldn't tell you in an email about a bomb in April of 2012?
Well, Congresswoman, I did not conduct most of the business that I did on behalf of our country on email. I conducted it in meetings. I read massive amounts of memos, a great deal of classified information. I made a lot of secure phone calls. I was in and out of the White House all the time. There were a lot of things that happened that I was aware of and that I was reacting to. If you were to be in my office in the State Department, I didn't have a computer. I did not do the vast majority of my work on email. And I bet there's a lot of Sid Blumenthal's emails in there from 2011 too. And so I think that I don't want you to have a mistaken impression about what I did and how I did it. Most of my work was not done on emails with my closest aides, with officials in the State Department, officials in the rest of the government, as well as the White House and people around the world. And thank you for sharing that, because I'm sure that it's not all done on emails, Madam Secretary, and there are meetings and there are discussions.
So the follow-up question that I would have asked is, she clearly used email in 2011. That's what this big stack of emails is right here. I think earlier in the hearing, they say there was maybe like 600 or 700 emails concerning Libya in 2011. This little stack right over here behind the play button is how many emails were sent or received about Libya in 2012. And I think that one has less than 100. So clearly, despite what she says in this answer, that she just talked to people, she was using email to conduct foreign policy in 2011. So what occurred that necessitated the change for her to move away from email in 2012 and just rely on this more meetings and discussions and being in and out of the White House type of strategy that she was using? So there's 3 ways that you could look at that. I think the least likely, but number one, you could say Hillary's telling the truth, and for reasons she does not care to explain, She just decided to stop using email to communicate her foreign policy business. Don't know why, but maybe she did that. The second way you could look at it is what I think Susan Brooks is alluding to here, is that she just stopped caring about Libya. That's why she wasn't emailing about it as much anymore. It wasn't on her radar, and the security was getting worse, but she just didn't really care about it anymore. Or you could look at it the third way, which I think is the most likely, is that these emails in 2012 concerning Libya and Benghazi would have been part of the 30,000 that she deleted. So we don't have any way of knowing that. So up to you to decide. But in that clip, you might have noticed that she made a reference to Sid Blumenthal and Sid Blumenthal emails. So before we move on, I want to explain who Sidney Blumenthal is and what his connections are to the Clintons. So Sidney Blumenthal first was in the Clinton orbit. He's been in there for a long time. And during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, he was running interference by planting stories in the media that Lewinsky was just a stalker who was making the whole thing up, and all of her stories about her affair with the president were just her delusion. And if it wasn't for the fact that Monica creepily kept that stained blue dress, which proved her story, that would have been the official narrative. And then Sidney Blumenthal surfaces again during the 2008 primaries when Hillary was running against Barack Obama. And the issue of whether or not Barack Obama was actually born in the United States, which is a theory that's often cited as being rooted in racism, was actually started by the Clinton campaign and spread through the press by Sidney Blumenthal. So when Hillary gets named Secretary of State, she tries to hire Sidney Blumenthal as one of her advisors at the State Department, but he was denied by the Obama administration. So instead, he starts getting paid $10,000 a month by the Clinton Foundation. And according to the official record of Hillary's emails, he was her most prolific correspondent on Libya and Benghazi. But since she was told that she couldn't hire him, she would just redact his name from the emails and the information that he was sending her before she passed them on to various government agencies. So in this next clip, you will see that Hillary doesn't deny what I just said. Instead, she actually attempts to justify this by arguing that information is more credible when you don't know the source of that information, which really defies all logic. But I also enjoy this next clip here, because you'll get to see Hillary contradict herself and then get caught in a lie and her reaction in real time. And I think it's funny.
Now, before you give Mr. Blumenthal too much credit, you agree he didn't write a single one of those cables or memos he sent you.
I'm sorry, what?
He didn't write a single one of those cables or memos.
I don't know who wrote them. He's the one who sent them to me.
Would you be surprised to know not a single one of those was from him?
I don't know where he got the information that he was
Did you
sending
ask?
to me.
Did you ask? You're sending me very specific, detailed intelligence. What is your source? That seems to me like a pretty good question.
I did learn later that he was talking to or sharing information from former American intelligence officials.
By the name of? Who wrote those cables?
I don't recall. I don't know, Mr. Chairman.
You had his information passed on to others, but at least on one occasion you asked Ms. Abenine, can you print without any identifiers? Why would you want his name removed?
Because I thought that it would be more important to just look at the substance and to make a determination as to whether or not there was anything to it.
Well, don't people have a right to know the source of the information so they can determine credibility?
But he wasn't, as you just said, the source of the information. That was.
But you didn't know that, Madam Secretary, and that's what you just said.
No, Mr. Chairman. I knew that he didn't have the sources to provide that information. I knew he was getting it from somewhere else. Whether he knew a lot of journalists. He knew others in Washington. It could have been a variety of people.
Well, if you're going to determine credibility, don't you want to know the source?
Well, it wasn't credibility so much as trying to follow the threads that were mentioned about individuals. And as I already stated, some of it was useful and some of it was not.
Well, Did the president know that Mr. Blumenthal was advising you?
He wasn't advising me. And, you know,
Did he
Mr.
know
Chairman,
that he was your most prolific emailer that we have found on the subjects of Libya and Benghazi?
that's because I didn't do most of my work
That's
about
fair.
Libya on
I'm
email.
not challenging that, Madam Secretary. I am not challenging that. All I'm telling you is the documents show he was your most prolific emailer on Libya and Benghazi. And my question to you is, did the president, the same White House that said you can't handle him and can't hire him, did he know that he was advising you?
He was not advising me, and I have no reason to have ever mentioned that or know that the president knew that.
All right, I want to draw your attention to an email about Libya from Mr. Blumenthal to you, dated April 2011. It will be Exhibit 67. And this is this is informative. Should we pass on, and in parentheticals, unidentified to the White House? If you're going to pass something on to the White House, why would you take off the identifiers?
Because it was important to evaluate the information, and from a lot of intelligence that I have certainly reviewed over the years, you often don't have the source of the intelligence. You look at the intelligence and you try to determine whether or not it is credible, whether it can be followed up on.
Well, I'm going to accept the fact that you and I come from different backgrounds, because I can tell you that an unsourced comment could never be uttered in any courtroom. You have
We're
to
not
have
talking
the
about
right.
courtrooms, Mr. Chairman.
No.
We're talking about intelligence.
No, we're
and-
talking about credibility and the
Well-
ability to assess who a source is and whether or not that source has ever been to Libya, knows anything about Libya, or has business interest in Libya, all of which would be important if you were going to determine the credibility, which I think is why you probably took his information off of what you sent to the White House.
So she mentions in that clip that sometimes in intelligence, you don't know the source of the information, which I will concede that sometimes might be the case. But in this instance, she did know who the source was. And there is a big difference between not knowing something and intentionally obscuring that information. So in the last clip that we're going to watch today, Gowdy asked Hillary a question that I think is very important. And it takes on a more significant level of importance because Hillary refuses to answer it. And to provide some context before I play the next one, this starts off right after Gowdy has read some Sidney Blumenthal emails where he takes some pretty massive dumps on Barack Obama and other White House officials. Oh.
Blumenthal could not get hired by our government, didn't pass any background check at all, had no role with our government, had never been to Libya, had no expertise in Libya, was critical of the president and others that you worked with, shared polling data with you on the intervention in Libya, gave you political advice on how to take credit for Libya, all the while working for the Clinton Foundation and some pseudo news entities. And Madam Secretary, he had unfettered access to you. And he used that access, at least on one occasion, to ask you to intervene on behalf of a business venture. Do you recall that?
You know, Mr. Chairman, if you don't have any friends who say unkind things privately, I congratulate you. But from my perspective,
I'd like to think I
don't
correct them.
I don't know what this line of questioning does to help us get to the bottom of the deaths for Americans.
So Hillary had a friend and a Clinton Foundation employee who had business interests in Libya who was sending her intelligence on Libya. And she even says, some of it's true, some of it's not. And before she passed that information along to where it would be used to shape U.S. foreign policy and justify U.S. military intervention, she intentionally obscured the fact that this information came from someone whom she was specifically prohibited from consulting by the Obama administration. And I find it disappointing that Gowdy took her bait in that clip and engaged with her in a pissing match on who had nicer friends, instead of pressing her on what business interests does Sidney Blumenthal have in Libya? And is it a conflict of interest with the information he was giving her? Which would explain her motivation to skirt that line of questioning, and would also explain why the Obama administration was so keen to push the spontaneous reaction to a video falsehood to, in their own words, deflect from a broader failure of foreign policy. Because if you don't have a foreign policy and you're only over there to benefit the business interests of a Clinton Foundation donor, that's not going to look very good to the public. So this question never gets answered in the Benghazi hearings of what business interest does Sidney Blumenthal have. But fortunately, it was relatively easy to find this information for myself once I knew the right questions to ask. And it appears that Sidney Blumenthal worked with a company called Osprey Global Solutions. So it's referred to in this January 2016 article from Vice News. Osprey invests in something called sovereignty changes, which is essentially striking a deal with a rebel group who is trying to stage a coup in their country to overthrow their government. And these companies like Osprey Global Solutions that engage in sovereignty changes, these companies seek to profit off of the military, medical, and rebuilding contracts that would be granted to them once this new government takes over. So at the time, back in 2011, 2012, there was a rebel group who I believe called the TRC, and they wanted to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. And Obama was hesitant to intervene because he was about to run for re-election, and Libyan intervention was not very popular amongst US voters. But Osprey and Sidney Blumenthal had financial interest in seeing Gaddafi removed. So he would use his access as a Hillary Clinton friend and Clinton Foundation employee to send her intelligence that supported or justified US intervention to help these rebels succeed. And then Hillary would take that information that he gave her, remove his name from it, and the conflict of interest that are posed, and then she would pass that information along and use it to justify war. And none of that is disputed in the 24 hours of Benghazi testimony. It was acknowledged and attempted to be justified. But I can think of few things that are as concerning or antithetical to American values than using the US military to further a personal friend's business interest. And it shocks me that this aspect of the Benghazi investigation has been virtually ignored by the media. So thank you for watching episode 2, and tune back in to see future installments on things that I'm really frustrated that are getting overlooked and ignored by the mainstream news media.